Thank you very much, James, for those kind words and the great work done by Energy Citizens to provide a grassroots voice for Canadians who want more Canadian energy in the world. Thanks very much to New West for putting this together, the organization otherwise known as Solberg Cubed. Solberg, and Sonia. But the smartest Solberg, Deb, should be actually the boss of the firm as far as I'm concerned. But thank you, Monty, to you and your team for bringing us together and a great selection of speakers to talk about the future of this industry that has been the engine of Canada's economy in so many ways in recent decades, and which is all about developing in a responsible way the world's third largest energy reserves, Canada's largest export product, an industry obviously responsible for employing hundreds of thousands of Canadians directly and benefiting millions of others in so many ways. You know, I was just out in Atlantic Canada speaking to the Atlantic Institute for Market Studies 2 nights ago, and reminded them that on average, in the last decade, some 170,000 Atlantic Canadians moved to Alberta, in addition to which about 25,000 others fly to Alberta as non-resident workers, as fly-in, fly-out employees. And that these folks have been able, as Rex Murphy reminds us, to move from often economic dependency and a dead end to opportunity and reliable income for them and their families, reinvesting back in their communities. We should never forget that this industry has been the greatest engine of social mobility in Canada in recent decades. So thank you for calling us together, Monty and team, to discuss its future. Before I go any further, I should recognize I've got a couple of members of our official opposition caucus in the Alberta Legislature here, Ron Orr, Devin Dreeshen, and Angela Pitt, as well as federal energy shadow minister Shannon Stubbs. Thanks to all of you for your public service and for being here. So friends, let me tell you that, just to give you a bit of a context here, we are expecting an Alberta provincial election next spring. Our operating assumption is it will be most likely in May. And so I and my party are working right now on developing a platform which will be a blueprint, a costed, realistic, and comprehensive blueprint for reigniting Alberta's economy and renewing the Alberta advantage. It will be in order to do so, it will be essential that we restore investor confidence where there has been a catastrophic failure of it, not just in the energy industry, but in other industries as well. As you know, in the last 3 years, we have seen the flight of some $40 billion of capital investment from Canada's oil and gas sector alone to the same sector, the same industry in other jurisdictions, and the cancellation of tens of billions of dollars of other prospective new investments like Petronus's LNG $35 billion investment. So we're approaching nearly $100 billion in capital investment that's either been canceled or withdrawn. Much of those resources have simply gone to other jurisdictions that are more competitive. It's not simply the problem of the price differential, which we're going to hear a lot about today. On that point, by the way, I know we all hear the estimate that this is costing us $100 million a day because of our landlocked situation. But Jim Gray, one of the eminence grise of the Canadian oil patch, calculated for me that if you include the natural gas price differential and you calculate the cost of about $11 billion in foreign oil imports, primarily to Eastern Canada, that the total the total cost to our economy as a result of landlocked Canadian energy is in the range of $46 billion based on today's prices, which represents about $14 billion in foregone revenues for Canadian governments. As I said, I was speaking in Halifax the other day. Their entire annual provincial budget is $14 billion. This is catastrophic for our economy. And so it's in this context that we are developing a platform to restore investor confidence. We haven't answered every question yet, and we'll be releasing that platform in the spring in the run-up to the next provincial election. But I can tell you that it will include rapid action to reduce the cost of life and the cost of doing business in Alberta, beginning with a summer session of the legislature which will begin with Bill number 1 of a prospective Conservative government, the Carbon Tax Repeal Act, which will repeal the current government's 2015 Climate Leadership Plan Act. Now, I know that there are some in this room and in this industry who don't agree with that approach, but two-thirds of Albertans do, even though the government has spent millions of their tax dollars and massive support from elite opinion telling people that somehow they can save the global environment by imposing a massive tax on Alberta seniors to heat their home in a cold winter, or working families to fill up their gas tank to drive to work and live normal lives, that somehow punishing ordinary people for living ordinary lives responsibly constitutes an environmental policy. You know, the same carbon tax advocates, I think, have been fundamentally dishonest. Well, they were dishonest in Alberta, I submit, by not being forthcoming about their carbon tax plan in the last provincial election. The federal government that announced its federal carbon tax plan 48 hours ago was anything but explicit about this in the last federal election. And of course, the carbon tax advocates all depend on the political dishonesty of frog-in-the-pot incrementalism, starting here in Alberta with the $20 carbon tax, raising it to $30, then going to $50. But we all know where they're really headed. And it's time that we invited the advocates, who I respect, to be absolutely honest about their ultimate goal. Environment Canada says that should be $300 a ton, and the IPCC panel 2 weeks ago says it should be immediately $200 a ton, going to $5,500 a ton. Now, I know that from the comfort of the 40th floor C-suite of an executive office or the faculty lounge of one of our universities, that maybe it doesn't really matter that people are paying an effective 100% tax on home heating as it is. Maybe it doesn't matter that the Sundre Senior Centre is spending 10% of their meager $18,000 operating budget just to heat their centre so they can provide an active life for seniors on modest incomes in rural Alberta. But to many real people, it matters a whole lot. We've also been told by the carbon tax advocates, don't worry, there's going to be these generous rebates that make it progressive. Not true. Here in Alberta, they've announced that as they increase the carbon tax from $30 to $50 a ton, a 67% increase, there will be zero incremental increase in the rebates. So roughly 1/3 of Albertans get a rebate now, and that will stop in terms of, it becomes a regressive tax as they raise the rate. If you think they're going to provide the same rebates at a $200 or $300 a ton carbon tax, instead of scooping the revenue for general government purposes, then I've got some swampland in Florida to sell you. They also tell us that this is a brilliant and clean efficient way, alternative to costly regulation. And so I challenge the carbon tax advocates to identify for us a single government regulation that has been eliminated in lieu of the carbon taxes. Or what is their dereg plan? They don't have one. Both federally and provincially, the plan is for more and more and more regulation, including now the pernicious Bill C-69, what I call the No More Pipelines Act, or the new Clean Fuel Standard, or Bill C-48, or the cancellation of Northern Gateway. So tell me, where is the dereg plan that the carbon tax advocates say is part of this brilliant Pagovian tax? Then they told us that it was all about that we were going to buy social license. If we just punished seniors for heating their homes in a cold Alberta winter, that somehow the enemies of Canada proposed carbon tax, or the voters of Ontario who just elected a government explicitly opposed to carbon tax, or the voters of New Brunswick who have apparently voted for an incoming government that will join the growing interprovincial alliance. So I make no apology for saying that Bill number 1 of a future United Conservative government would be the Carbon Tax Repeal Act. Obviously, we would then be challenging the constitutionality of the federal tax that's just been announced, but we will be doing so in good company with the provinces of Saskatchewan, Ontario, Manitoba, and New Brunswick, potentially Prince Edward Island, and I believe other partners in the Federation. Secondly, we will begin with immediate reductions in the business tax burden on the Alberta economy to send a message that Alberta is open for business again. But because we will be, I think, limited in our ability to maneuver fiscal levers for to stimulate the economy, I think because we'll be inheriting potentially a deficit of around $7 billion and a debt of $60 billion with $4 billion in interest payments, I think we're going to have to overcompensate on the regulatory side. And here we hope to replicate the success of Gordon Campbell's BC Liberal government, which under the capable oversight of Kevin Falcon managed over the course of its first term to reduce by about 1/3 the regulatory burden on the British Columbia economy. I believe we're not just facing a price differential problem, but also a regulatory differential problem. I hear from people in the industry every day that they can get approval for a simple project, for a simple exploration project, for example, in West Texas in a week or two, where it's taking sometimes a year or 18 months in Alberta. That projects are getting approved in Saskatchewan in a couple of months that are taking over a year to be approved here in Alberta. I think this is the unintentional result of just a constant accretion of more and more regulatory complexity. And so our goal will be to listen intently to operators in industry about how we can rationalize and reduce the regulatory process, to move from the model of consecutive regulatory applications with multiple agencies and ministries to concurrent applications, to omnibus applications. Rather than applying for dozens of projects in one region, why not allow an omnibus application to go forward? And to adopt an outcome-based approach to regulation rather than a process-obsessed approach to regulation. So that will be critical. Thank you. So this is an open invitation to those of you who encounter these regulatory impediments to let us know how we could help you respect high levels of health and safety standards, environmental standards, not to sacrifice those standards, but to apply them in a sensible way that moves at the speed of business rather than the torpor of bureaucracy. So those are some of the substantial points that will be fleshed out in our platform. But now I really want to talk about, pull the camera back and talk about the bigger picture. I think we've made the mistake of being far too tactical and not sufficiently strategic in addressing the challenges facing our energy industry. We look at the cancellation of Northern Gateway, Bill C-69, the federal government's killing of Energy East through its new regulatory mandates, the surrender to Obama's veto on Keystone XL, his veto itself, the campaign of political and legal obstruction on Trans Mountain, C-48, the Northern BC Coast Tanker Traffic Ban. We tend to look at these and other policies or developments in isolation. I think one of the things I hope can come out of this conference is for us to pull that camera back, or to look at it from 30,000 feet, and to see how these things are actually in some ways interconnected. I believe that all of those developments that have been so injurious to this province's prosperity were in part the result of a highly successful, deliberate, well-organized, and hugely well-funded campaign of defamation that for at least the past decade has sought to defame the production of Canadian hydrocarbon energy based on a massive double standard not applied to other major energy producers. Most of you in this room know what too few political leaders do. That 10 years ago at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund in New York, a conference was organized by that fund, co-sponsored by the Hewlett-Packard Foundation, to develop what is called the tar sands campaign, which was at which some 24 ostensibly environmental organizations, were invited to develop and implement a strategy funded in part by those foundations to landlock Canadian energy, particularly bitumen. The Pembina Institute, which some companies in this room have given money to, was a charter member of that campaign, whose explicit goal has been for a decade to landlock Canadian energy. So let's begin by stopping the pretense that the groups who were around that table in Manhattan are somehow balanced or neutral. They are not. They've signed up to a political, not a research project, to a political campaign of activism, which has pursued a multifaceted, diversified strategy that involves everything from sending paid door knockers out to swing ridings in federal elections, to massive phone bank operations, to paid advertising, to huge social media campaigns, to funding anti-energy litigation, and all of it together designed to landlock our energy, with hundreds of millions of dollars put behind it. As we know, Vivian Krause from Vancouver has identified, for example, to be illustrative, $90 million that's gone from the U.S. Tides Foundation to the Canadian Tides Foundation specifically for this purpose. The ultimate source of the U.S. Foundation's funds are obscure. We don't know what those sources are. We do know that Tom Steyer, a U.S. hedge fund billionaire who made part of his fortune on coal and natural gas, boasts openly about having spent $200 million US on his campaign to persuade President Obama to exercise the presidential veto of Keystone XL. He became the largest donor to his party in order to get that done. $200 million. That's as much as you would spend, as political parties cumulatively would spend in 4 federal Canadian elections, to put this in perspective. So we are talking here collectively about hundreds of millions of dollars. Recently, a United States Senate committee came to a bipartisan conclusion that Russian social media farms had engaged in a coordinated campaign to oppose pipelines being built in North America. And so much more evidence about foreign sources of funds behind this campaign. So I think we need to understand the nature of this these political forces that are behind the landlock strategy. That is why I will be articulating in our platform what I call a fight back strategy. It will begin with the creation of a well-resourced war room at the Alberta Department of Energy, whose mandate will be to respond in real time through paid, earned, and social media to all of the lies and myths told about Canada's energy industry. It will also have a litigation fund to support pro-development litigation, and particularly coming from the First Nations who want to be partners in prosperity. Why is it that in the debate about the duty to consult, the courts and the public and media seem to focus exclusively on the minority of First Nations who are anti-development? I think it's brilliant that we see a consortium of Northern BC First Nations, the Eagle Spirit Consortium, saying, where was the federal Crown's duty to consult us before it arbitrarily vetoed an approved pipeline, Northern Gateway, that would have been an opportunity for us to move to prosperity? And isn't it a shame? You know, the First Nations that got to the Federal Court of Appeal on Trans Mountain were funded by the Tides Foundation, similar foreign sources of funds, and often that kind of litigation is funded by the federal Crown. But the Eagle Spirit First Nations have to crowdsource fund in order to hire lawyers to make their claim that their duty to consult has been violated. If I'm Premier, we'll be writing checks to allow them to go to court. We'll be supporting pro-development litigation. Thirdly, we will address the flagrant violation of Canada's charity laws by organizations that are political pressure groups obsessed with shutting down Canada's energy industry, masquerading as charities. And so I will ask our Attorney General to develop the evidentiary case of the violation of our charities laws by a number of these groups, including those that were involved in the recent Trans Mountain litigation. And we will send that evidence down to the Canada Revenue Agency. If the agency refuses to act on that evidence in a reasonable amount of time, then we will make an application at the federal court for mandamus writ, compelling the CRA to make an administrative decision on the flagrant violation of charities law by the David Suzuki Foundation and its fellow organizations. Thirdly, next, I will call into the Premier's office the heads of our major energy companies and invite them to discuss a new approach to social license. If they want social license to develop the resources that belong to Albertans, we will expect them to actively defend those resources and the people who work in those companies. I will be looking for an energy company that has legitimate standing to replicate the litigation strategy of Resolute Forest Products, which is suing Greenpeace under the RICO statute in American courts for $300 million in damages for its 20-year-long campaign of defamation against RFP's responsible forestry practices. The same organization, Greenpeace, and many of its allies have engaged in exactly the same kind of defamation. By the way, at discoveries in the U.S. court, they admitted that they purposefully lied about RFP's forestry practices. It's time to make these organizations be responsible and accountable for what they do and what they say. It's time to make them lawyer up and to put them on the defensive for having tried to kill this country's engine of prosperity. Next, if we have companies like foreign, multinational companies like HSBC. HSBC has announced their intention to effectively boycott credit facilities for the Canadian oil sands, while at the same time being a major supplier of credit to Vladimir Putin's Russian oil industry. So if companies like HSBC buy into this international boycott campaign, then the government of Alberta will boycott them. They won't be doing any business with the government of Alberta or any of its agencies if they decide to apply a double standard to this province and its economy. Finally, this fight back strategy will involve real consequences for partners in the Federation who violate the economic union of Confederation through arbitrarily trying, through regulatory or litigation strategies to block the export of our largest product. For example, the British Columbia government's opposition to Trans Mountain. I was proposing 15 months ago, that we be prepared to replicate Peter Lougheed's 1981 turn off the tap strategy. I'm glad that the current Alberta government finally came to see the wisdom of that approach. Unfortunately, I think their fellow travelers in Victoria don't really believe they're serious about this, since they've called the Edmonton's bluff. But I think Premier Horgan would understand that I am serious about defending the vital strategic interests of Alberta using every tool at our disposal. And then finally, I think it is time for us as Albertans, not all Albertans in this room, and this applies to Saskatchewan, the two primary contributors to equalization and the whole system of fiscal federalism. It's time for us to identify our greatest points of leverage on these issues. You know, as I said to 500 Atlantic Canadians 2 days ago, Albertans, Westerners are generous. We don't mind sharing much of our prosperity when times are good here and bad elsewhere. We're proud to have played that role, and that role that has been fueled by the energy industry. But what Albertans find unacceptable is governments and political leadership in other parts of the country wanting to benefit from the wealth generated from this energy industry while doing so much to block its development, the development of these resources. I said in Atlantic Canada, how can you expect to benefit, for example, from wealth generated by fracking in BC, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba when you've imposed a moratorium on fracking, that you refuse to develop your own resources? This is unacceptable. It's not acceptable that politicians in Quebec who benefit from $11 billion net in equalization and much more through other transfers, federal transfers, have stood in opposition to Energy East as an example. And so I'm prepared to do whatever we can to advance our demands just for fairness in the Federation. One strategy that has been proposed that I think has merit would be to say to the federal government that if you insist on proceeding with the No More Pipelines Act, Bill C-69, if you refuse to guarantee us the construction of a coastal pipeline to significantly reduce the price differential, then we will put equalization on the table, not waiting 5 years for renegotiation, but immediately by triggering the 1998 Quebec secession reference of the Supreme Court of Canada, which says that if a province holds a referendum on a constitutional amendment with a clear question and a clear majority voting in favor, it imposes on the federal crown a binding obligation to negotiate that amendment in good faith with the province. So I would be prepared to hold, in principle, to hold a referendum in Alberta on Section 36 of the Constitution, equalization. Based on my polling, about 90% of Albertans would support it. And that would then impose on the federal government an obligation to sit down and to discuss with us the terms of equalization. It doesn't mean we would get our desired outcome, but what it would do is to take a page out of the playbook of Quebec political leaders who have been so effective at asserting their province's agenda at the national level. It is time, folks, that we stopped being passive, defensive, and apologetic. It is time, I submit, it is time that we used all of the political and economic levers at our disposal. I'll just close with this. According to the International Energy Agency, there will be a growing global demand for hydrocarbon energy through at least the 2040s. Since the tar sands campaign began a decade ago, there has been an increase in consumption and supply of oil of 10 million barrels per day. That initiative hasn't done anything to reduce consumption or demand or supply. This question is existential for our economic future, but it is also, I submit, a moral question. Either through surrender to these foreign-funded sources of defamation of this industry in Canada, either we abandon global energy markets to the world's worst regimes, to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the dictatorship in Iran, the catastrophic dictatorship in Venezuela. Either we allow them to dominate global energy markets, or with determination, we move forward on the offensive, unapologetically, to do everything possible to get our Canadian energy to global markets. I think the world is counting on us to get it done. Thanks very much. I'm happy to take questions. Got 15 minutes.
I'm going to see, can we get this mic on?
Why don't you just use this one?
Okay. Hello, testing. There we go. So, Jason, thank you for that very spirited speech. I think you got everyone's attention this morning. A lot of people, I think, were a little tired when they first came in. Not so much now. So, thank you for that. Very specific proposals. Absolutely great content, and I think people know exactly where you stand. We're going to ask people to submit questions on Slido right now. If you would do that, please. Do we have any questions that are already in there, Matt? Can you? Okay, we're just pulling that up. But in the meantime, you didn't really talk about Justin Trudeau, except to talk about equalization. Tell us about how you'll work with the Prime Minister should you become Premier 6 months from now.
Well, I know the Prime Minister quite well because he was my critic in opposition for the better part of 3 years. So obviously, we'll have to try to work constructively with the federal government, but I've indicated that we will, first of all, we won't be beating around the bush when it comes to opposing federal policies that are injuring Alberta's economy. And so, you know, for example, we shouldn't be calling for tweaking of Bill C-69, but rather for the federal government to withdraw Bill C-69 completely. This is going to have catastrophic consequences for investor confidence. So we need to be, you know, I'll give you another example. Just last night, the House of Commons voted down Senator Doug Black's Bill S-245, which would have declared the Trans Mountain Pipeline as being for the common advantage under Section 9210C, the National Interest Clause of the Constitution. that bill, it's not some cockamamie idea. It was supported by 3/4 of the members of the Senate, who thought that at least for greater certainty, it was worth using that bill to underscore federal paramountcy on that interprovincial infrastructure project. So that's the sort of thing where I believe the government of Alberta should be aggressively advocating for measures like that, which are in our interests.
So we have some questions from the audience here, thanks to Slido. First question is, do you support carbon markets, not to be confused with carbon tax?
If by that we mean cap and trade, no.
Okay. I think it might be something slightly different than that. I think they might be asking about the concept of attaching, sequestering carbon and that kind of thing through no-till practices and that kind of thing.
And part of our proposed alternative to the current government's policy will involve, I think, some of the elements of the Saskatchewan government's incentives, for example, for zero-tillage farming and responsible forestry practices to increase the enormous natural carbon sinks that we have in Canada. And by the way, I think this was a mistake of the Harper government as well as other previous federal governments. We should have demanded as a country credit at Kyoto and all the subsequent COP conferences for the enormous natural carbon sinks in this economy. If the Russians got credit for the deindustrialization of the Soviet economy in 1990, why don't we get any credit for the massive carbon sinks that are a result of our responsible forestry and farming practices?
Thanks very much for that. I think we probably have time for one more question, and then I think we have to let you go, regrettably. So here is a question. Oh, where did that go? It disappeared. Well, there's one up here that I think is probably on a lot of people's minds, just because of the announcement the other day.
You got the screen right down there.
Oh, sorry. Oh, we do. There. Awesome. So the question is,
if this politics thing doesn't work, can I get hired at Solberg Cubed? What's going on?
You'd clearly be at the top. So the question is, if you become premier and scrap the carbon tax, won't the federal carbon tax just replace it? What's the difference?
Well, again, we would join the growing interprovincial coalition challenging the constitutionality of the federal carbon tax. As Premier Moe will explain this afternoon, he has made an application for a judicial reference at the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal. The Government of Ontario has sought intervener status to support that while pursuing their own reference in the Ontario Court of Appeal, and we would be joining those provinces together with New Brunswick and Manitoba in that challenge, and it will get litigated out to the Supreme Court of Canada, obviously. It's by no means a slam dunk, but I think there is a credible argument on the side of the provinces in this respect. And if we were to lose ultimately that appeal, I've always said that we would provide a full rebate back to Albertans. What I find interesting about the federal announcement of 2 days ago is they're proposing a 100% rebate notionally for 100% of households, as opposed to Alberta's partial rebate for 2/3 of households that stops at $30 a ton. So oddly, the federal scheme announced 2 days ago would be a net fiscal benefit for Albertans over the Alberta plan.
Well, I think that's all the time we have. So Jason, Kenney, thank you very much for a terrific presentation this morning.